Special thanks, Yehuda, to you for being our speaker today. Greetings to everyone from Bloomington, Indiana. It's a beautiful sunny winter day here. I hope all is well wherever you are. What a treat it is to begin our new series with Yehuda Bauer. If I had to name one person who unofficially is the dean of Holocaust studies and anti-Semitism studies, it would be Yehuda Bauer. Thank God he continues to work, even now as he approaches middle age. Yehuda, may that continue for a long time. A year ago, the Journal of Holocaust Research, which I'm holding up here, published at the University of Haifa, dedicated the entire issue to Yehuda Bauer in recognition of his many, many contributions to research and teaching on the Holocaust, as well as his signal contributions in other respects as well. He was educated early on in Wales and then at the Hebrew University. He went on to teach for many years at the Hebrew University. With his distinguished colleague Yisrael Gutman, he turned out generations of Holocaust scholars and teachers themselves. Among his other distinctions, he was the founding director of the Vidal Sassoon Institute Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University. Among many things about Yehuda's work that I myself admire and have learned from is his lucidity. Yehuda is always crystal clear in what he writes and in what he has to say. One of the quotations that I have before me that I'll pass on to you is this. It has to do with the spelling of anti-Semitism and who anti-Semites are. I'm quoting Yehuda when he says, anti-Semites do not hate Semites, they hate Jews. It doesn't come more clear or more forcefully than that. Yehuda, it's my pleasure now to turn over to you. We look forward to listening to you and learning from you as we have for many, many years.
Thank you very much, Albin. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me say a few comments on the subject of anti-Semitism. Now, the term anti-Semitism is actually nonsense, because there are no Semites that you can be anti to. You can dislike languages, but you can't be against the language. You can't be against Indo-European languages. So there's no Semitism you can be anti to. There are people who speak Semitic languages, including, for instance, Tigrian in northern Ethiopia and Eritrean. Of course, anti-Semitism doesn't turn against them, turns against Jews. And the term was coined, as probably all of you know, by a German radical nationalist and racist. Actually, he was using it because it was invented before him in 1879. And he made it clear that he did not like the term Jew hatred, which was common in the German version and in other versions as well. He wanted to have a pseudoscientific term with an ism attached to it that would make it a kind of a scientific expression. Now, the point is that the Jew hatred or the dislike of Jews is usually connected with the rise of Christianity. But I think that's wrong. There was anti-Jewishness before Christianity arose. And this you can actually see in the Bible itself, in the Scroll of Esther, where the story is that in the Persian Empire, the Jews were to be annihilated. Of course, the Scroll of Esther was written by Jews, not by anti-Semites. And why were they supposed to be annihilated in Persia? Because, as the Scroll of Esther says, because they do not observe the customs of the king. The Hebrew term for custom was dat. Now, that was a Persian word, which did not make religion. It meant customs. In other words, the dislike of Jews because they were different in their culture from others. Originally a polytheistic ethnic unit, they developed a belief in a deity that was both tribal and concerned with the fate of this particular ethnic and religious group. And at the same time, it was universal and controlled the whole world. And such a deity could not have expression in statues or in any physical way. And so a culture developed slowly, not all at once, over a long period of time, which was quite different from the culture of the people who were surrounding it. Now, as long as the Jews were staying in their little country on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, they were just another oddity, and nothing much would have happened to them as such. But because they rebelled against the Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BCE, their temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in 586 BC, and the elite of the group was exiled to Babylon, as you all know. Now, after that, after quite a number of years, in 539 BCE, the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and their king, Cyrus, issued a declaration in 539 BCE that permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem, the elite that had been exiled. Now, only a small number of people actually utilized that. But they managed to establish a ethno-national group in Jerusalem and around it. And they were supported by the Persian Empire because the Persian Empire encouraged small groups of various ethnic and religious groups to establish themselves as vassals of the Persian Empire. So the Persians were friends of the Jews. And you can see this in the Bible. If you look at, for instance, at the book of Nehemiah in the Bible, he was actually a Persian, a member of the court in Persia. He was sent by the Persian king to Jerusalem to reestablish a center for this particular Jewish people. They were not called Jewish yet, but they developed into that. And so the whole story of those hundreds of years is a story of the friendship of the Persian Empire for its own reasons to this particular group. Now, when you look at the Scroll of Esther, it becomes very peculiar because it actually goes against the history that we know. There was no Persian persecution of the Jews, quite the contrary. There was a support of the Persians. So how did the Scroll of Esther arise? I prefer the interpretation that the Scroll of Esther was written under Greek rule, which followed the Persian rule after the conquest of Alexander the Great in 333 BCE. And in the story of the Greek control of the area, there was a clash between the Greek power, the kings of the heirs of Alexander the Great, the Seleucids in Syria, who wanted to unify culturally everybody under their rule. And so they wanted to, I mean, you could, for instance, call your god Baal or Zeus or Jupiter. It was the same god, different statues, but the same God. Jews could not accept that because by that time they had developed into a culture that could not accept the deity of statues, could not accept the deity of a king like the Seleucid king in the 3rd century BCE, who not only worshipped gods, but demanded of his people to see him as a representative of the god or even as the god himself. Now, this was totally unacceptable to the Jews. And so the story of Esther actually tells us from a Jewish perspective. As I said, the scroll of Esther was written by Jews, not by anti-Semites. The reason for disliking or hating or wanting to eliminate the Jews was their difference in culture. So the origin of anti-Semitism is not Christianity. The origin of anti-Semitism is the difference in culture, religion, and ways of life of a particular group of people who developed this separate culture, which was anathema to the forces, the political forces of the time. So when you ask, what is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism starts by saying very clearly, we dislike the Jews because they are different from us. Now, the Jews dispersed in the Persian, Parthian, and Roman empires. They dispersed not because they were driven out, but because these were large entities. The Jews rebelled against the Romans because they wanted to defend their independence. And when they were defeated, they were not exiled by the Romans. They left the area of what is now the land of Israel. They left it in numbers that stretched over hundreds of years until the 4th or 5th century, hundreds of years after the rebellions against the Romans. There was still a Jewish majority in the land of Israel. But there was a settlement of Jews elsewhere, and they brought with them as units, as communities, their peculiar culture and religion. And whenever there was a crisis in the place where they lived, there could be an attack on them. They were defenseless because they were a small minority. And they were disliked because they were different. Now, this happened not very often. And again, one of our mistakes is to see anti-Semitism as something that is prevalent everywhere where the Jews were living. That's not true. In most of the places, in most of the times, there was no active physical anti-Semitism or even economic anti-Semitism. In many countries, there was actually no hatred of Jews for hundreds of years. But there were places where there was. If I give you some example, for instance, in France, after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, for hundreds of years, until the 11th century, Jews were actually seen as a positive remnant of the defeated Roman Empire, and they were welcomed. They were given support, both by the emerging royalty and by the aristocracy, and by the peasantry, who saw their activity as craftsmen and merchants in a positive way. So there was no anti-Semitism. And there are other places like that. Anti-Semitism is something that is an option. It is an option in situations where the ruling culture and political rule and so on is under attack or has problems that it doesn't know how to solve. And then the Jews could be, as I said already, could be the butt of the attack. Not necessarily so, not always so, but yes, occasionally yes. So when we deal with anti-Semitism, don't make the mistake of saying that was always anti-Semitism wherever Jews were. That's not true. And there were, in fact, areas where Jewry spread, where the Jews became the rulers or the people from whom other derived their culture and society. An excellent example for that is North Africa. In the Atlas Mountains, there's a ethnic unit called the Berbers. It's not Arabs. They are, before Arabs came there, Berbers ruled the place. And it is interesting to see that a large number of Berbers converted to Judaism. And in the 7th century, there was even a queen, a Jewish queen of a Berber state that defended the area of the Berbers against the invading Muslim Arabs. So it is much more complicated than people think. And the development of anti-Semitism is connected to this basic thing, the difference in culture as the basis, and then added to that economic and social and political elements, which you can follow through the history. In the 19th century, this became a European phenomenon because, yes, now because of the Christian predominance, because you could either be a Christian and believe that the Messiah had already come, or you could deny that and say that the Messiah will come in the future. In other words, you don't accept Christianity. And there was an attack on the Jews as a result of that. Of course, Christianity is originally Jewish, and it turned against the Jews because it wanted to differentiate itself from them. And slowly the anti-Jewishness of the Christian religion and afterwards of Islam became predominant in the beliefs of Christianity. It was that basic element that became a European phenomenon. And as some of the great academics who dealt with the problem said already, that anti-Semitism became a European phenomenon, almost independent of the Jews. You had anti-Semitism without Jews, simply because that became the rule of ideology in those places. Now with Islam, it's quite different. Islam arose because of a struggle against the Jews. The Jews controlled a city in the Hijaz, in the area which is more productive in the Arab Peninsula than others, a city called Yathrib. Now Yathrib changed its name to Medina, and Medina is a Hebrew name. It means a city or a state. And for Muhammad to become the head of a new approach to religious beliefs, he had to struggle against 3 Jewish tribes in Medina. He annihilated one, he expelled the other, and he then attacked the third that retreated to another place and finally eliminated it. So Islam is based on anti-Jewishness. Now then, Islam was aware that it was based on Judaism. So there's also another tradition in Islam, more friendly one to the Jews. But Islamic anti-Semitism is different from the anti-Semitism that was prevalent in Christianity. I think we should remember that. So you need to separate these things. And it's very interesting to know that in most of the countries of the world, in India, in China, in Japan, with one exception, there was no anti-Semitism. Although there were Jews. In China, there was a pretty large Jewish community from the 9th century onward in a certain area of China. Slowly disappeared by assimilation. The last Chinese Jew who could say that he was the descendant of a Jewish minority in China died in 1911. And in India, there were 3 separate Jewish communities. All these communities were never persecuted. There was no anti-Semitism for a very simple reason. In all these places, you could be different and nobody cared. So you were different, so what? I remember a Indian engineer in India when I was there asking me what belief do I have. So I explained to him. And he said, oh, well, that's fine. You believe in that. And I believe in Krishna and Ram. And that was it. You believe in this and I believe in that. There's no reason why we should feel some enmity one towards the other. I think you have to realize, as I said just now, that in most of the countries of the world, with a large number of inhabitants, there never was any anti-Semitism, and there will never be one. There was one exception in Japan by a small Christian minority there that developed, in part of the Christian minority, anti-Semitic views. But they were exceptions. Japan was never anti-Semitic, nor was China, nor was India. Anti-Semitism is something that is connected to the development of the Jewish people. It became as I said, a cultural phenomenon. And to fight anti-Semitism, it is not, it cannot be fought just by legal means or by propaganda, although those are important elements, and I'm not against it by any means. I'm in favor of it, but you can't fight anti-Semitism like that, ultimately. Anti-Semitism can be fought by the fact that anti-Semitism is a danger not only to the Jewish minority, which today numbers some 13 million people, 14 million people. It's a danger to the societies in which it grows. An excellent example for that is the statement by Hitler in the summer of 1936, in which he said very, very clearly, and let me quote what he said there. It was the only memorandum that he ever wrote, August 1936. I'll quote it because it also shows you how completely illiterate really Hitler was. He says, since the beginning of the French Revolution, the world has been drifting with increasing speed towards a new conflict, whose most extreme solution is named Bolshevism, but whose content and aim is only the removal of those strata of society which gave the leadership to humanity up to the present and their replacement by international Jewry, unquote. This is August 1936. It makes it very clear that one of the basic reasons for the outbreak of World War II was anti-Semitism, because Hitler and his followers believed that Bolshevism, the enemy of Nazism, is actually Jewish. And the purpose of Bolshevism is to establish international rule of the Jewry over the world. Now, the result of that was World War II. And World War II cost, just in Europe, 35 million dead at least. Several million of them were Jews. But all the rest, some 29 million or what, were non-Jews. And why did they die? Because of an ideology, the basis of which was anti-Semitism. Is that not reason enough to be opposed to anti-Semitism as a non-Jew? Not as a Jew, as a non-Jew. Because anti-Semitism is a danger to all societies in which it spreads. I think it's very important to realize the global issue behind anti-Semitism, that it is a danger to societies in which it spreads, in which it rules, in which it has influence, including the American society. There's always, according to opinion polls, there's always a minority of some 15 to 20% of Americans who can be defined as anti-Semites. But anti-Semitism is much more widespread than that. Not openly, but I would say by a hint, by using language and thought that includes opposition to Jews without really them realizing what they're doing. And one of the ways in which anti-Semitism can be fought is to make it clear to the non-Jews how dangerous it is to them, not just to the small Jewish minority, but to them. And I think that that is the basis of what I wanted to say. And it is something that you don't hear from very important organizations and Jewish leaders and so on. They think that if you tell people how lovely Jews are, how many Nobel Prizes were given to Jews and so on, that will make any difference. It won't. It won't. The fact that Jews are lovely people does not convince anyone. And by the way, Jews are not necessarily lovely people at all. So the whole basis of the struggle against anti-Semitism in America is, to my mind, wrong, totally wrong. So you better think about it. Thank you very much.
Yehuda Bauer, thank you so much for this very forceful talk. First of all, taking us through the history, going back a very, very long time, and explaining to us the positive and negative developments there, and then with your clear call also for actions. I think a lot of people will take up the opportunity now to join us for a discussion with you. I invite everybody who wants to have a question or comment to join us on the panel with Professor Yehuda Bauer. So if you want to join us, you can use the little hands up button, and I will invite you to the panel that you can join the panel. You can also use the chat function to send us your question or comments on the chat.
Let me answer the chat questions first.
Yes.
Were Jews called Hebrews or Israelites before they were called Jews? Yes, of course. Not Hebrews, Israelites, because they were members of a tribe, of a society of tribes. What are the origins of the Jewish tribes who battled Muhammad? This is something we don't know. It is assumed that these are converts to Judaism from the Yemen, because there was a conversion by Yemenites to Judaism, and they traveled north to Medina. Did they basically come from ancient Judea? They were mostly converts, probably. Okay.
Thank you. Let's take Nora Gold's question first. Please, can you unmute yourself and make yourself visible if that's possible? And afterwards, Judith Goldstein.
Okay, I'm trying to make myself visible. I'm on a laptop in Paris. Is that better? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Bauer, first of all, I want to say this was an extraordinary, revelatory talk for me, because I've never heard this analysis before. It helps to explain for me why so many of our efforts, and I include my own here, to combat anti-Semitism have been unsuccessful. And I'm in Canada, even though now I'm in Paris. Your critique of American approaches to fighting anti-Semitism, I think, are very correct in many respects. And I also found it almost shocking, although delightful, that your point about how there hasn't always been anti-Semitism everywhere, which is my view, but it seems to be almost ubiquitously accepted by people. You know, b'chol dor v'dor, they've always hated us, they'll always hate us. And that gets used as a justification for all sorts of Jewish behavior and mistakes, in my view. So I wonder if you could, first of all, so a very big thank you. And the question is, if you could elaborate on what you think organizations could do concretely to combat anti-Semitism. You made your point very clearly and forcefully, but I wonder if you could elaborate on a practical level.
Well, I think I answered that question, actually. I'm not against what ADL is doing. I think Jonathan Greenblatt is doing good work. It's just that it's not very effective. And what I was aiming at is really a complementary kind of approach, not saying that what he's doing is bad, but to add the things that I was talking about. That's basically it.
How do you persuade or educate non-Jews about the fact that this isn't going to work for them, that it's going to be damaging for them? Of course, there are historical examples. Some are receptive to those examples. You gave obviously a very powerful one. But as someone who has been involved in this field, there are many non-Jews who don't find that kind of argument persuasive. Maybe they just
you see, what I suggested was elements that I don't think they ever heard a talk like this before. And I used comments or documents or sources that are available to everyone. This is not something new. What I was quoting from has been known since the Nuremberg trials of 1945. It's part of the record. It's just not used. And I think a redirection by academics to return to the actual documents that I was quoting would help very much in the academic field, first of all. Now, it's well known that what the academics write about is not necessarily what the students know. So
Very good.
and the general public. So it's a question of a long-term approach. And I would say that what I was presenting here was, I was quoting documents. I wasn't inventing anything.
Yeah, sure.
And I think if you go in according to that line, you might get somewhere. After all, I mean, anti-Semitism in the United States is one of the issues, one of the many issues that Americans have. It is not a central issue.
Yeah.
It is, and to combine the fight against anti-Semitism with a fight against racism, although those two things are completely different. But to combine them, although they are different, I think it's not bad. It's not a bad idea at all. I think that it will make the struggle against anti-Semitism more effective if this is done in this way. Again, I'm not an American. I never intended to be an American. Although I spent a lot of time in America. And this is actually what I have to say. Now, there are some chat questions, and let me answer them. Well, somebody asked me a specific topic, but can you say a word about the term Amida? To stand up, not in a religious sense, the Amida in the prayer, but Amida, the original Hebrew term meaning standing up against, to describe resistance during the Holocaust, and your thinking on that term today. Well, actually, as a term for armed and unarmed resistance, Amida is my invention. So obviously, I'm supportive of my own thought. Indian Jews always point out, as you did, that their Hindu neighbors were never anti-Semitic. But the Chinese and Christian Japanese, so because of Buddhism. Well, no, because of the general culture, which accepted different groups with different beliefs and had no problem with that. Is there any way in which this important information is being made more generally available? No, that's why I'm talking about it. So again, I'm not inventing anything. Just go to the sources and look at it yourselves. Social media proliferation, it says here, is expediting increasingly rapid dissemination of novel forms of expressions of Jew hatred. Do you perceive any new opportunities to quell anti-Semitism with new social media games to generate pro-Jewish, anti-BDS, anti-Israel apartheid this is a very difficult question. You talk about social media. I would say anti-social media, because the social media are actually a tremendous danger to society. Now, the attack against Israel can be anti-Semitic, often is anti-Semitic, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. If you oppose Israeli policies against the Palestinians, you're not an anti-Semite. You oppose policies of an independent state in its fight against others. Nothing to do with anti-Semitism, actually. It can be anti-Semitic when you attack Israel because it's Jewish. Then it becomes anti-Semitic. Now, this differentiation was pointed out by the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and I'm the founder of it and the active honorary chairman. And actually, this differentiation was introduced with my agreement. I did not actually write it, but I supported it.
Yeah, thank
now,
you, Professor. Professor Bauer, maybe we can take also some questions from the panel directly because they're coming more and more chat questions. So let's take Judith Goldstein and then Talor Cohen, who I know has worked a lot on the social media things, and I've worked with her on this. So let's take it in this order. Judith.
Professor Bauer, a question: what is so addictive about anti-Semitism?
That's an excellent question. It's the tremendous impact that Jewish culture had on Western society. First on Christianity, and then in a quite different way on Islam. Now, this addiction, as you put it rightly, to anti-Semitism does not extend beyond that. As I said before, it doesn't exist in India. It doesn't exist in China. In Japan, it was a minority amongst the Christian converts in Japan. The majority of the Christians in Japan actually are pro-Jewish, but there was a small group that was anti-Jewish. That was the only exception.
Thank you. Talor Cohen, please.
Thank you, Gunther, and thank you, Yehuda. It's a privilege always to hear you speak. I always learn more and more. I think as somebody who looks at online anti-Semitism and specifically looking a lot at the diaspora communities, the United States versus Europe, and the recent survey that came out by the ADL, I wanted to ask you if you, in your analysis from what you see today, do you see the United States as currently going through a crisis where the Jews can be the butt of an attack? Meaning, you talked about very specific developments in a society, culturally, economically, that can result in an anti-Semitic attack. And I'm wondering, as somebody who's reading the material coming from the United States, if you think that that is a possibility in the United States today, or if it's overblown and we're participating in alarmism.
Well, I have difficulties in predicting the past. I am completely useless regarding the future. I don't know. What you have in the United States is, of course, something that could develop into a danger to Jews, but a danger to the society because of anti-Semitism, as I put forward. Whether it will happen or not, I have no idea. It's the same thing in Europe, basically. But European anti-Jewishness is weaker because of the Holocaust, because this is where the Holocaust happened, and there's still opposition to anti-Semitism. Sometimes just in words, not in content, but it exists, and so the situation is different there. And what is dangerous to my mind is Islamic radicalism, because Islamic radicalism is, of course, not connected to Europe and the Holocaust as such. It is a development within Islamic society, not necessarily Arab, because there are pro-Jewish elements in the Arab society, and there are anti-Jewish elements in non-Arab Islamic society. So I would not identify Islamic radicalism in all cases with Arabs. I think that's wrong. So what you need is, first of all, an academic understanding in order for it to spread slowly, as these things always happen. We academics think we have swallowed the wisdom of the world. We haven't. We are proved wrong time and time again. And I don't exclude myself from that.
Thank you. Let's go next to Ralph Kolb and then Dina Porat. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Can
Yes.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. I am a graduate of the both the Cohen Center in New Hampshire and the Yad Vashem school for overseas school for Holocaust educators. And through both of them, I've been exposed to your writings and have to precede my comment and my question by an expression of gratitude for the contribution you made to both of them. Really a voice of, a mentoring voice that transfuses their curriculum in both places. And I have one note before I ask my question. You had talked about emphasizing in our fight against anti-Semitism the danger that anti-Semitism poses to non-Jews in non-Jewish predominantly societies, that is to say everywhere except Israel. I'd like to recommend a book by George Gilder, The Israel Test, which traces that history and talks about, makes clear, not that Jews are good people, but that the benefits to the host societies is often a bellwether for their fate. Your analysis is mostly historical, and here I come to my question. I've been an educator and I've worked, of course, with students and with co-educators who are not Jewish, especially in the United States. And I'm troubled by my failure to confront a predominant assumption, I should say, a given, especially in America, that anti-Semitism is just like other prejudice. It's a matter of irrational and ignorant attitudes towards people who are different from your cultural group, and that education and outreach are the essential tools. And at the Cohen Center, I was, of course, with many people who fight anti-Semitism. I'm with them 100%, but it's not on their analysis, which is to basically say we can't compare suffering, which I agree with. We can't say whether the Rohingya or the Armenians suffered more. It's not a question of an Olympics of suffering, but I do lack the ability to say, but the anti-Semitism, not the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism is sui generis. It can't be understood in the same way that the temporally and geographically limited prejudice like the Armenian genocide or the Rohingya genocide. And I end up seeming to myself and certainly to my cohorts as someone who's just a Jewish particularist. I'm just out to say the Jews deserve more attention, or the Jews deserve more sympathy, which is not what I'm after. I think that the analysis is incorrect, and yes, I would like your response to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the Holocaust was sui generis in a way, in many ways. There's a big discussion about Dina Porat, who is next. We had a long argument about that. So this is not something that is generally accepted. What is special about anti-Semitism is that the Jewish culture had a tremendous influence on Western society. First of all, the Christian society, but also on the Islamic society. Tremendous. So to say that anti-Semitism is like other hatreds of ethnic or religious groups is simply wrong. Anti-Semitism is very different because of the impact that Jewish culture had. It created Christianity in a way, in a completely different way. It created Islam. So half of humanity is influenced by the Jews. So hatred of Jews becomes something really very special, because the Jews, now you may like it or not like it. Many people don't like it, including Jews. But the Jews are a group that has developed very unprecedented ways of thinking, of organizing a culture over a long period of time. Originally, the Jews are polytheists. They worshipped many gods. And the wife of God in the Bible, the Asherah, was presented by a statue in the Temple of Solomon. So we come from a long period of internal struggles. And these internal struggles ended up in a culture. The particular or peculiar element in it is that it is based on dialogue. It is based on multiple choices. It is based on arguments. We did not have one state in ancient times. We had two. The Talmud was written both in Baghdad and in Jerusalem because they couldn't agree with each other. And within the Talmud, the whole thing is argument. The whole thing is who is right, different interpretations. And why? Because if situation changes, there's the opposite opinion that you can refer to. In the Jewish civilization, this policy of dialogue continues to the modern times. The Hasidim, founded in the 18th century by a wonderful monk, Jewish monk, Israel Baal Shem Tov, was opposed by the traditional Orthodox Judaism. There was a violent struggle. There were physical fights. There were accusations of the other side before the Russian Empire. In other words, the Jews are a typical case or a very extreme case of a culture that is moved forward or backwards or sideways by disagreements. I think this is the crucial element to understand about Jewish culture. Now, when anti-Semitism comes about, it turns against everyone like that. It doesn't differentiate between the different views in the Talmud or the difference between Hasidim and Mitnagdim and so on. Anti-Semitism is against the Jews as such. Why? Because of the cultural element in anti-Semitism. People explain anti-Semitism by economic and social means. Now, those are important elements, but they come in addition to the cultural elements. So Marxist interpretations are completely wrong. This is a situation which was caused by thought, by culture, by attitude to spiritual things, but also by, they were founded also by economic and social conditions. So this complication is something that anti-Semitism attacks.
Thank you. Dina Porat, good to see you. Another eminent scholar here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alvin and Ginter, for organizing this. And thank you, as usual, Yehuda. As Alvin said, he's always clear-cut, has an original idea, a new idea. Thank you, Yehuda, for being Yehuda. I have the following question. You called, and quite rightly so, I think everyone was convinced, you called for a certain strategy that at the core of which is explaining and convincing non-Jews that anti-Semitism is a danger to them, both physically, socially. It's a danger to them, not just to the Jews. Would you agree that recently we do see sign of such understanding of non-Jewish societies, governments. In recent years, you have more budgets for education, for legislation, for security and protection of Jewish communities. You have strategic plans. Austria was the first to come up with a long strategic plan against anti-Semitism. Then recently there is a German one. The EU was presented to us in Malmo. And just a few days ago, one in the United States, a whole strategic plan to fight anti-Semitism, and declarations of leaders, etc. So there is activity, and who knows better with the new sitting in the IRA and being its honorary chair, that after the Malmo conference, Sweden is out to convince all those who pledged to fight anti-Semitism, the many countries and leaders who pledged there, to fulfill the pledge. Now, would you agree that there are these signs of understanding that it is their problem as well? Otherwise, why do they do all this? But that there is a discrepancy between these efforts from above and the ground, and the anti-Semitism that goes on its way on the radical left, on the extreme right, Muslim, the media, social media. There is a discrepancy, a gap between these efforts from above and the street, and the fact that anti-Semitism goes on even harsher than before. Would you agree? And
I'm
if
afraid.
how pessimistic can we be?
I could be even more pessimistic. In other words, I agree with you. So, and of course, you sit at the hub of knowledge about these developments, and you're absolutely right. There is a effort directed by the understanding that anti-Semitism is dangerous to non-Jewish society, and there is a lack of success in fighting it. And I don't know the answer to it. I frankly, I try to influence people as far as I can, sitting on the 6th floor of an old age home, which is not very, useful for practical work. But this is what I can do. But I completely agree with you. It's a situation which you, the people who head the organizations that can make a change, I think you should continue your work and deal with it. Now, there's a lot of opposition to ADL, for instance, to Jonathan Greenblatt and so on. Now, it's not that he doesn't know what to do. It's that the ways in which they're doing it are not efficient. And not being an American, I cannot really answer the question. But I'm sorry to say that I agree with you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, both for the question and for your answer. I want to maybe go into one or two questions from the chat. There were two questions about the influence of the Christian churches today in America, and Alvin Rosenfeld has written and talked about the resurgence of religious anti-Semitism again. What do you think about this topic?
Well, I think one has to differentiate between different Christian churches. Mm-hmm. The Vatican is an ally in the struggle against anti-Semitism. There's no doubt about that. Started with good Pope John XXIII, Angelo Roncalli. It carried on, and Giovanni Montini, Paul VI. It became very obvious under John Paul, the Pole, when John Paul, you know, as Pope came to Israel and went, you know, a frail old man relying on his stick, went and embraced the Polish survivors and said to them in Polish, you know, that he identified with them. If at that time had been elections in Israel with John Paul as a candidate for president, for prime minister, he would have won 100%, you know. I mean, you have a differentiation between the Vatican and especially the Jesuits, I must say, who were anti-Jewish in the extreme under Lewandowski, and then today they are pro-Jewish. There's a difference between that and a number of Protestant churches, also Catholic anti-Semites who do not follow the line of the Vatican. Now, they are influenced by the general society. This is not part of the Christian doctrine. I mean, you can interpret the Christian doctrine as anti-Jewish, yes, but that's not the reason why today they are anti-Jewish. They use the doctrine in order to fight Jews. So you have a differentiation between different kinds of society, of religious groups. In America, especially the liberal Christian denominations that tend to be anti-Semitic. But that is due to the political issues, not because of theology, because you can interpret theology any way you like. Theology is not something permanent. It changes according to the political and social and economic situation in which people are. You know, the idea that theology is something permanent is absolute nonsense. It changes all the time.
Thank you. We still have questions here on the panel. Next, please, Sergio de la Pagola, and then Ariella Gedra Hendler. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your names.
Good evening, Yehuda from Jerusalem, and hello, Alvin and Gunther. My question to you, Yehuda, I am one of those who have signed the IHRA declaration. It is not perfect in my view. It can be improved, but it's better than nothing. But my question is how you comment on the animosity of the opposition to it by JDA, the Van Leer group, and other groups, the animosity and the virulence of the attack done by people who are knowledgeable academics on the whole. What's your explanation of this?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sergio, for your question. We are old friends, so it's I'm not surprised. Now, to say that I have an answer to your question would be wrong. I wonder myself, because their attack on the statement of anti-Semitism by IRA is actually illogical. If you look at the statement they made, you analyze it, you find that it can be interpreted to support the opposite of what they are saying that they are supporting. If you look carefully at the wording, you can see that it can be interpreted to support Israeli policy against the Palestinians, which is not what they want. They want the opposite. In other words, these are failures, academic failures. This is not something unusual in Jewish society, you know. You find it quite often, you know this very well. I analyzed the JDA and published it somewhere, I don't remember where now. And I showed that they achieved the opposite of what they want. It is not because they are stupid. They are not stupid. It's because they have a deep misunderstanding of anti-Semitism and the position of the Jews in the world. You can be against the policies of the Israeli state against the Palestinians. You can be. And you can support Israel at the same time, a different Israel from the one that is now in power and so on. You can be. Nothing to do with anti-Semitism, except if you say that the policies of Israel are the result of the Jewishness. There are people like that. Now that is anti-Semitism. In other words, they're anti-Semitic Jews. They always were. Yeah, you know it very well, Sergio. They're always anti-Semitic Jews. Can we fight them? With great difficulty.
Thank you. Ariella, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much for being here, Yehuda, and for permitting and for having this opportunity. Everybody's moving forward with things. I'm going to go backwards into what you said. I spend a lot of time on social media, on Clubhouse, talking to people about what happened, about anti-Semitism, about anti-Zionism. So I'm really curious about something you said, because it was such a neat little package in our narrative to say, well, the Romans came in and then we lost and they dispersed us, and that's how we got into the diaspora. But you came in and said, no, that's not what happened. I believe you said that there were Jewish groups that left of their own accord, and that the majority of Jews still stayed in Israel. So I wondered, so that's the end of that neat little package that I used in our narrative. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that just a little bit more. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but if you could just add something to that, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's a very difficult question to answer briefly, because the Jewish minority in what is now the state of Israel under the Persians was just a few thousand people, and a larger and larger number of inhabitants of the country became Jewish in different ways. And when finally there was a Roman rule, there was some 4 million Jews in what is now the state of Israel. It was a huge development. So most of the Jews are not descended from Jews. And of course, the Jewish nationalists don't accept that. But they run against the documentation and the knowledge that we have of those periods of time. And then after the rebellions against the Romans, as I said, for hundreds of years, there was a large Jewish community in what is now the state of Israel. But Jews left. Now, I must emphasize this. The story that the Romans expelled the Jews from the state of Israel is absolutely wrong. They did not. They took some 25,000 prisoners whom they sold as slaves. Most of these slaves were released by the Jewish communities that already existed in the Roman Empire. And there was actually, you have this in the Mishnah, hints of that, of large numbers of people who converted to Judaism. So contrary to what the rabbis are telling us, Jews are not descended from Jews originally, in their majority probably. In the minority, yes, and DNA probes seem to prove that. But that does not mean anything, because it's the Jewish culture, the Jewish civilization that is important, not whether you are physically descended from Jews. I personally, for instance, know that I'm descended, amongst other things, from a French soldier in the Napoleonic Wars. And my son-in-law is a grandson of a Rom, a gypsy. I mean, we are, we are complicated people. And what is important is the culture, the civilization, not the biological origin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have still Michael Trason and Rachel Halpern, but briefly on the chat there was a question I'd like to go into about the successes of fighting anti-Semitism. So there were two questions related to that. One was, when were periods where there was more in history, more philo-Semitism or more positive views of Jews? What were long periods? And also another question was, what were successful societies in fighting anti-Semitism?
Well, the long periods I already said is a typical example is France. Yeah, France in the Middle Ages, until the blood libel of Bois in 1071, but also in other places. And of course, anti-Semitism took place without Jews because of the Christian attack on the Judaism. The typical example, of course, is Russia, where until 1772, under the Tsarist regime, there were no Jews because Jews were considered to be enemies of the church. So there was anti-Semitism without Jews. There were other places where there was no anti-Semitism in the Western civilization, and I already talked about India and China. In the Christian countries, there were cases where Jews were not attacked at all. I myself come from an area where the Jews were living in villages in Moravia. There was never any anti-Semitism there because the Jews lived like all the others. They spoke the same language. They spoke Yiddish as well, but they spoke the local language. They participated in the local life. There was never any anti-Semitism there. That's a typical example. I examined this carefully because of my own family descent from these people. There were also cases in other countries. In Bulgaria, for instance, in Albania, there were several cases like that where there were societies where there was no problem. You were different, okay, so you're different, so what?
Thank you. Michael Trason.
Thank you. Yehuda, you've disclaimed any expertise because you're not an American to comment on the American environment, but I think you're very qualified. And we've been hearing so much about anti-Semitism in America and that a huge number of Jews feel there is anti-Semitism. But we use the term anti-Semitism in America the same way we may use it in other settings in other eras. I wonder if you could comment on distinctions, especially between institutionalized, state-sponsored anti-Semitism, which has existed in some countries, even to some degree was institutionalized in the States, at least before the war and after the war, versus what we see now, which it seems to include violence by outliers who aren't part of any particular organized group, but express their violence through anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish verbiage and behavior.
Yes, I think you're right. It's there's a differentiation there. If you have an anti-Jewish element in the state, in the political configuration. In Europe, you have different countries with different traditions. In Poland, for instance, today, you have both. You have a growing understanding by liberal Polish intelligentsia of the Jewish situation and the pro-Jewish stance on the one hand. You have a clear anti-Jewish attitude which is based on what happened during the Holocaust, when the majority of the Polish population was anti-Semitic and helped the Germans kill the Jews. You have a completely different situation, for instance, in Romania, where there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and this changed after the war. As a result of the Ceausescu regime, there was a change in attitude. In fact, the statement by IRA on anti-Semitism was initiated by the Romanian ambassador to IRA, Mihai Constantinescu. Was a wonderful man. Unfortunately, he died in 2007, but you may have known him. This is a very clear case of a change in attitude. Today, if I want to pick out anti-Semites, in other words, people, non-Jews who struggle against anti-Semitism, I would certainly mention Romania. It's quite different from what happened before. You have the same situation in Bulgaria, for instance. You have a situation in certain other countries where the local attitude wavers between different times, different generations. And there's a clear case is Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, who would have dreamt that the Ukrainians in 2019, by a majority of 73%, would vote for a Jew as a prime minister? Wouldn't have been possible. It's a change of generations. Their fathers and grandfathers were anti-Semites and murderers. Very clear. With a few, with exceptions, of course. But the change of generations means a change of attitudes very often. And I think you have to follow this. In other words, a definition that fits all cases is from the beginning wrong. You have to see, as Heraclitus of Ephesus said in the 5th century BC, you never enter a river twice, because each time it's a different river. So you have to remember that.
Thank you, Yehuda.
Thank you. Rachel, Albert, please go ahead.
Hi,
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for taking my my question. I was born and raised in Poland, a daughter of Holocaust survivors. I did a lot of my own reading on the history of the war, and I myself came to the conclusion some years ago, exactly what you said, that Hitler waged a war against Jews, and an unspeakable number of millions of people died, and that anti-Semitism is really a danger to the larger society. Can you comment on whether or not, about how that, whether or not and how that expresses itself in the Islamic societies, given that much of the—
In what?
Well, much in the Muslim societies. In other words, Europe paid a huge price for anti-Semitism. Can you say the same thing about Muslim societies? What price did they pay for the kind of specific characteristic Islamic anti-Semitism?
Well, Islamic anti-Semitism is a real danger. I mean, that's clear, because it repeats the Nazi ideology, and it is based on honestly believed ideology which they developed. Now, there's also an opposition to Islamic anti-Semitism in Islamic society. Yeah, there was a conference in Morocco some years ago, a few years ago, with about 100 imams, Muslim teachers, against anti-Semitism. So you have, you know, again, you should be very careful to differentiate between different streams of society. You can say majority here, majority there. In Poland, there is absolutely no doubt that the majority of the population in Poland during the war was anti-Semitic. The Poles said so. There is a statement by the leader of the Polish underground in 1941, Rosecki, a statement which was transferred to London, to the Polish government in exile, which said the Polish population is anti-Semitic. Not Jews said it, Poles said it. So I think that does not mean to say that there were not tremendously courageous Polish people who rescued Jews. There were quite a number of them, very large number of them, but they were a minority.
Thank you. Let's go to one last question from the chat. There is a question by Ruben about the origins, what you told us about the hatred of Jews or animosity against Jews in the beginning. And if I understand that question correctly, it's about, was that maybe that also happening against other tribes, and what made it different from that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. No, it was only towards the Jews, because it was the Jews who denied the existence of the gods and developed a culture that said it. And the fact that the Seleucid kings wanted to unify all the peoples under their rule in one culture, which would be a Greek culture, was the reason for this opposition. Now, it's interesting that the Jews themselves were occasionally quite weak in their opposition. For instance, the Hasmonean rebellion against the Greeks, Antiochus IV, yes, in 161 BCE, led by the Matityahu and his 5 sons. Yes, this is a very well-known thing. Now, this was against the Greeks, but his sons assumed Greek names. And then the Hasmonean kings were Greek in culture. They not only had Greek names, they founded Greek cultural institutions without abandoning Judaism. They tried to combine the two things. So it's not, you should not follow the rabbis, in in explaining Jewish history. When I see a rabbi teaching Jewish history, it is very rare that I can agree with what he's saying. Usually they have not the slightest idea. It's pure ideology.
Yehuda Bauer, thank you so much for this really outstanding, illuminating talk. As you see, we have started a good discussion among us. Thank you also all for joining this really outstanding panel with such good questions and great people. I will hand over back to Alvin Rosenfeld to conclude our webinar for today. But thank you very much for this talk again, and for all of you joining us.
Yehuda, I'll simply add my thanks to Günther's. It was wonderful seeing you again, hearing you again, learning from you again. Your talk was very wide-ranging and as sharp as could be. We look forward to staying in touch. Stay well and keep busy. We will as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you especially, Alvin, for your initiative. All the best.
Goodbye.
Bye.